dark messages hidden in the Bible they don't want you to see. For centuries, the Bible has stood as the foundation of spiritual truth for billions of people across the world. It is often presented as a sacred book of love, hope, forgiveness, and divine wisdom. Sunday sermons echo with verses of mercy and salvation. Pastors preach about the gentle, loving nature of God. But what if that's not the full picture? What if the Bible also contains dark, unsettling, even dangerous messages? Messages that have been buried under centuries of selective teaching, institutional control, and social conditioning. This isn't about attacking faith. It's about uncovering the parts of Scripture that have been deliberately ignored or glossed over. There are verses that speak of genocide, slavery, child sacrifice, divine wrath, and severe punishments, verses that most religious institutions avoid at all costs. These uncomfortable truths don't make it into the average sermon. They're not printed on coffee mugs or quoted in wedding vows. And yet, they're there, hidden in plain sight. The question is, why? Why are certain messages amplified while others are silenced? Who decides which verses are relevant and which should be forgotten? And what does it say about the role of religion in our society when truth is filtered, repackaged, and sold as inspiration? The deeper you go into the pages of the Bible, the more you begin to realize that not everything is as it seems. There are darker layers beneath the surface, layers that challenge the sanitized image of Scripture we've been given. And once you start to see them, you can't unsee them. Religious texts, including the Bible, have long been used not just to inspire, but to control. They've shaped empires, justified wars, oppressed entire populations, and silenced dissent. In many cases, the most disturbing messages were the ones that held the most power, used by kings, priests, and rulers to demand loyalty, obedience, and submission. And yet, these same messages are conveniently left out of modern-day teachings. But what if some of these messages weren't just political tools? What if they were symbols? What if, hidden within these verses, there were esoteric truths meant for those with eyes to see? What if the Bible, beyond its surface meaning, contained a deeper spiritual code, one that's been misinterpreted, misunderstood, or intentionally distorted? This exploration is not for the faint of heart. It requires an open mind, a critical eye, and the willingness to question everything you thought you knew about one of the most powerful books ever written. In the chapters that follow, we will journey into the shadows of Scripture, shining light on the verses they don't want you to see. This is not about rejecting the Bible, but about finally reading it without blindfolds. The truth is not always beautiful. Sometimes it's terrifying, but it is always necessary. The forgotten verses, what the church rarely talks about. When you open the Bible, what do you expect to find? Most people would say love, grace, salvation, or maybe peace. That's what we've been told to look for, what we've been conditioned to believe the Bible is all about. And it's true, to some extent. The Bible does contain messages of compassion and hope, but it also contains stories soaked in blood, commands that strike fear, and divine actions that leave us questioning the very morality of the God we've been taught to worship. These are the verses no one reads aloud in church, the ones that never make it to the pulpit, the verses that are there, staring us in the face, but rarely acknowledged. Take a moment and ask yourself, have you ever heard a sermon about Psalm 137 verse 9? Blessed is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. This verse is in the Bible, word for word. A horrifying image, a blessing attached to the murder of children. And yet, it is glossed over or justified as historical context whenever it's brought up, if it ever is. This is not an isolated verse. There are dozens like it. Consider Deuteronomy 20 verses 16 to 17, where God commands the Israelites to kill every living thing in certain conquered cities, men, women, children, even animals. Genocide, in the name of divine instruction. Or Numbers 31, where Moses, acting under God's command, instructs his army to slaughter the Midianites, keeping only the virgin girls alive. For what purpose, the text does not say directly, but the implication is deeply disturbing. Let that sink in. These verses are not fiction. They're not hidden in apocryphal texts or lost scrolls. They are part of the very same Bible that millions of believers read daily. So why aren't they ever talked about? The answer is uncomfortable but necessary, because they threaten the narrative. They disrupt the sanitized version of God that institutions have built their power on. A God who only loves, who only forgives, who only saves. But the Bible presents a much more complex, and often darker, portrait. A God who orders destruction, who punishes nations, who tests loyalty with suffering, who appears, at times, more like a warlord than a shepherd. Religious leaders and institutions often avoid these passages because they know they provoke hard questions, questions that don't have easy answers. How can a loving God command such violence? How can morality come from a deity who, by modern standards, acts immorally? And if these verses are metaphorical, then who decides which verses are literal and which are symbolic? Where do we draw the line? And who gave anyone the authority to decide for everyone else? The deeper you look, the more you'll realize that the Bible isn't just a book of spiritual comfort. It's also a book of control. The early church understood the power of Scripture to shape behavior, to keep people in line, to justify authority. By cherry-picking verses and building doctrines around selective messages, leaders were able to sculpt a theology that served their agenda. And that manipulation still continues today. Even modern translations and footnotes attempt to soften the blow. Words are adjusted, tones are modified, and phrases that once invoked terror are rebranded as culturally specific or part of God's mysterious plan. But is that really honesty? Or is it damage control? Let's be clear. Understanding the dark parts of the Bible is not an attack on God. It's an act of truth-seeking. A mature faith must be able to wrestle with complexity. If your belief system cannot handle difficult questions, if it relies on ignoring large portions of its own Scripture, then is it truly faith, or is it just denial? There are those who will say these verses belong to a different time, that God was dealing with people differently then. But that argument raises more questions. If God is unchanging, as Scripture claims, then why the inconsistency? If morality is eternal, then how can what was once right now be wrong? And if we are to believe in divine justice, then how do we reconcile the systematic slaughter of entire populations as just? And then there's the issue of silence. The church's silence on these verses isn't just ignorance. It's intentional. It's preservation. If people truly understood what's in the Bible, many would begin to question not only their religion, but the very institutions built upon it. It's safer to preach love and light than wrath and darkness. But without confronting the shadows, we're not worshiping truth. We're worshiping a carefully curated illusion. The forgotten verses matter because they reveal the parts of God, of humanity, and of Scripture that we're too afraid to confront. They force us to ask, what kind of God do we believe in? What kind of relationship do we have with sacred texts? And more importantly, what is being hidden from us and why? You don't have to lose your faith to explore these questions. In fact, real faith might begin with them. Because it is only when we stop avoiding the dark corners of Scripture that we begin to see the full picture. Not the fairy tale, but the raw, unsettling, complicated truth. In the next section, we'll examine how these darker elements have been used, intentionally and strategically, throughout history, not just to inspire, but to manipulate and control. You'll begin to see that these verses were not just forgotten, they were weaponized. But before we go there, remember this: truth is not always safe, but it is always sacred. The power structure, how religion was used to control people. If the dark verses of the Bible were merely ancient relics of a violent past, they might be easier to dismiss. But history tells a different story. These verses weren't forgotten by accident. They were suppressed when inconvenient and highlighted when useful. In fact, they have been strategically weaponized across centuries to build empires, uphold institutions, and maintain control over the masses. From the very beginning of organized religion, spiritual authority has often been inseparable from political power. When Constantine adopted Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire, the Bible quickly became more than a book. It became a tool for conquest, a tool for obedience, a tool for legitimizing hierarchy. Over time, Scripture wasn't just interpreted, it was manipulated to serve the interests of kings, popes, and those in power. Let's take the idea of divine right, the belief that rulers are chosen by God and therefore must not be questioned. This concept, used by monarchs for centuries, was rooted in biblical passages that urged submission to authority. Romans 13 verses 1-2 says, Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. This verse has been quoted by dictators, presidents, and clergy alike to silence dissent. But ask yourself, does that sound like a verse that encourages freedom or control? The church, too, became a master of this strategy. During the Middle Ages, when literacy was rare, priests held ultimate power over the interpretation of Scripture. The masses were not just spiritually dependent on the clergy, they were mentally and emotionally enslaved by their monopoly on knowledge. Latin, the language of the Bible, became a gatekeeper. Only a select few could read it, and fewer still dared to question its teachings. Those who did, think of figures like Galileo or the early Protestant reformers, were branded as heretics. Many were imprisoned. Some were executed. Why? Not because they were evil, but because they challenged the structure. They posed a threat to the established order, a threat to the control that came from selective interpretation of Scripture. The manipulation didn't stop there. Verses that devalued women were used to justify patriarchy. 1 Timothy 2 verse 12, which says, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet," has been used for centuries to silence half the population. Even today, many religious communities still restrict women from positions of leadership, citing verses like this as divine command. And what about slavery? While the Bible includes moral teachings, it also includes detailed instructions about how to own slaves, how to treat them, and how to punish them. In Ephesians 6 verse 5, Paul writes, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ." During the transatlantic slave trade, slaveholders in America and Europe repeatedly used this verse to justify one of the most inhumane systems in history. These weren't fringe interpretations, they were mainstream, sanctified by pulpits and justified by Scripture. The terrifying truth is this: many of the darkest moments in human history have been supported, if not driven, by selective readings of the Bible. The Crusades, the Inquisition, colonialism, apartheid, even anti-LGBTQ laws, all have been propped up, at some point, by verses pulled from holy texts. The Bible, which was meant to liberate souls, has often been used to imprison them. But how did this happen? How did a book of spiritual wisdom become a handbook for manipulation? The answer lies in fear and the exploitation of fear. Religion, when weaponized, plays on our deepest anxieties: the fear of death, the fear of eternal damnation, the fear of divine punishment. When people are taught from birth that questioning Scripture is a sin, that disobeying authority is disobedience to God, they become easy to govern. They hand over their autonomy in exchange for salvation. They stop thinking. They start obeying. And those who pull the strings? They know this. They always have. But perhaps the greatest tragedy is not just that religion has been used to control people, but that people don't even realize it. Because the control doesn't always come through fire and brimstone. Sometimes it comes through comfort, through promises of safety, through community that feels warm and supportive, until you ask the wrong question, until you think for yourself. Control isn't always about chains. Sometimes it's about keeping you inside a fence you're too afraid to cross. This is not an argument against spirituality. In fact, true spirituality begins when control ends. Faith should empower you, not enslave you. The Bible, when read without blinders, is a complex and multifaceted text. But when filtered through centuries of power, it becomes a script. A script that tells you how to live, what to think, who to follow, and what not to question. You might wonder, what happens if we strip away the institutional filters? What happens if we read the Bible not as a dictated code, but as a layered, symbolic document filled with historical context, human perspective, and deeper meaning? That's where the next stage of our journey begins. Because beneath the control, beneath the fear, beneath even the darkest verses, there may lie a hidden code. A message not for the masses, but for the seekers. A truth that was never meant to be taught from a pulpit, but to be discovered through awakening. The power structure may have tried to hide it, but truth has a way of surviving. And once you begin to see the manipulation, you begin to see something else too: the potential for real transformation. Not through doctrine, not through dogma, but through decoding the spiritual layers buried within the ancient words. In the next part, We will dive into the mystery, into the symbolism, the hidden meanings, the esoteric truths that may have always been there for those with eyes to see. It's time to read the Bible not with fear, but with clarity, because the real message might not be the one they told you. Decoding the hidden symbolism, messages for those who can see. Not every message in the Bible was meant to be taken at face value. In fact, some of the most profound truths are veiled behind stories, symbols, metaphors, and mystical language that appears simple to the untrained eye, but transform entirely when viewed through the lens of inner awakening. If the Bible has been used as a tool of control, it has also been, perhaps paradoxically, a key to spiritual liberation for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. Jesus himself spoke in parables, often leaving even his closest disciples puzzled. When asked why he spoke this way, he replied in Matthew 13 verse 13, "Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand." This was not accidental. This was intentional. The teachings were encoded, not for everyone, but for those ready to receive them, for those willing to look deeper than doctrine. This invites a bold but essential question. What if much of the Bible is not literal history, but spiritual allegory? Let's begin with the Garden of Eden, perhaps the most symbolic story in all of Scripture. On the surface, it's a tale of disobedience. A man and woman eat of forbidden fruit and are punished. But beneath the surface, it's the story of awakening, of the transition from unconscious innocence to conscious self-awareness. The serpent, so often vilified, becomes a symbol of knowledge, of transformation, even of inner power. Is it any wonder that in many ancient traditions, the serpent is sacred, a representation of wisdom and the divine feminine? And what about the tree of knowledge? Why would a loving God place such a tree in the center of paradise and then forbid access to it? Could it be that this story was never about rebellion, but about the cost of enlightenment? That with knowledge comes responsibility, suffering, and the painful process of evolution? The Bible is filled with these dual meanings. Take the concept of light and darkness. On the surface, light represents God and good. Darkness represents evil. But what if darkness also represents the unknown, the hidden? The fertile ground where seeds of truth are planted, waiting for the brave to dig them out? Or consider the number 40. The Israelites wandered 40 years. Jesus fasted 40 days. Noah endured 40 days of rain. Is this a coincidence or a code? In mysticism, 40 often represents a period of transformation, of internal purification, of spiritual testing. These were not just time frames. They were signals. Even hell itself, often used to terrify and control, may be misunderstood. The original Hebrew word Sheol and the Greek word Hades both refer not to eternal torment, but to a shadowy realm of the dead, a place of waiting, not punishment. The word Gehenna, which Jesus often used, referred to an actual valley outside Jerusalem where trash was burned. So when he spoke of people being thrown into Gehenna, was he describing divine judgment, or using a real-world metaphor for spiritual decay? These layers of symbolism don't erase the Bible's darkness. They recontextualize it. And in doing so, they offer something extraordinary, a secret language that has survived empires, oppression, and censorship. A language that speaks not to blind obedience, but to the soul's awakening. The book of Revelation, often portrayed as a terrifying prophecy of the end times, is a perfect example. Full of dragons, beasts, trumpets, and plagues, it has been used to instill fear for generations. But when read through a symbolic lens, Revelation becomes a profound map of inner transformation. The 7 seals may represent the chakras or energy centers of the body. The beast may symbolize the ego or lower nature. The battle between good and evil is not an external war, but the war within. Why were these messages hidden? Perhaps they weren't. Perhaps they were simply not meant for everyone. Jesus said in Matthew 7 verse 6, "Do not give what is holy to dogs. Do not throw your pearls before swine." In other words, truth must be protected. It must be earned. It must be discovered, not handed out cheaply. Throughout history, mystics, Gnostics, and spiritual seekers have understood this. They read between the lines. They saw the divine not in laws and punishments, but in symbols, patterns, and paradoxes. They understood that real enlightenment cannot be legislated, it must be experienced. Sadly, many of these seekers were silenced, labeled as heretics, burned, banished, their writings destroyed or buried. The Gospel of Thomas, for instance, a text discovered in 1945, contains sayings of Jesus that emphasize inner knowing over external religion. In one verse, he says, "The kingdom is inside you, and it is outside you." This challenges the very structure of institutional faith. It shifts power from church to self, from ritual to realization. So what does this mean for us today? It means that the Bible is not a dead book. It is not meant to be memorized and repeated. It is meant to be decoded. The true message of Scripture is not about rules, rewards, or punishments. It is about remembering who you really are. It is about awakening to the divine spark within. It is about seeing past the literal to the eternal. This is not easy. It takes courage to confront the fear-based programming of childhood religion. It takes humility to admit that much of what we were taught may have been incomplete, or worse, deliberately distorted. But it also takes hope, because when we read the Bible with open eyes and an awakened heart, we discover that its deepest truths were never dark. They were hidden. Hidden not to be feared, but to be found. And once found, they set you free. The church may not want you to see these messages. The institutions may not teach them, but they are there, in the symbols, in the silence between verses, in the metaphors that resist literal interpretation. They speak to those who dare to see beyond fear, to those who believe that truth is not given, but revealed. Not everyone is ready to hear this, but maybe you are.